The Subcommittee on Housing and Insurance will come to order. Without objection, the chairman is authorized to declare recess of the committee at any time. This hearing is entitled Housing Oversight, Testimony of the HUD and FHFA Inspectors General. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chairman for inclusion in the record. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes to give an opening statement. Today, we will hold another hearing to bring accountability to government agencies and regulators, a top priority for me as subcommittee chairman in this Congress. It is a critical theme as the nation continues to experience one of the toughest housing markets that we've had. Testifying are the Inspectors General of both HUD, Housing and Urban Development, and FHA, the Federal Housing Finance Agency, whose work has been invaluable to Congress and to the American people. Inspectors General are in a unique position to ask tough questions, dig deeper, and ultimately root out waste, fraud, and abuse in the federal government. Fundamentally, they hold the government accountable for doing what the law says, whether or not people agree that it should be the law. And when it comes to HUD and FHFA, these two Inspectors General have their work cut out for them. Ms. Oliver Davis and her team have uncovered many deficiencies at HUD, including the failure of several public housing agencies to deliver on HUD's mission statement to provide decent, safe, and sanitary housing. We recently held a hearing on this very topic, and I can say that both sides of the aisle were appalled by things going on in our public housing authorities. The conditions for many residents of public housing are simply unacceptable, which is why the committee's considered several bills to hold public housing authorities accountable. We all know that these problems are likely just the tip of the iceberg for HUD. However, I have introduced my own bill to create a bipartisan commission that would take a broader look at HUD. And their job will be to evaluate the entire agency, provide recommendations to Congress to make HUD work more efficiently and effectively, frankly, to update the authorizations, many of which have lapsed, and to hopefully make some improvements dealing with benefit cliffs and kind of a standardized income asset test that would address things that Secretary Fudge pointed out in dialogue when she came to testify in January. When it comes to government regulators like FHFA, which oversee about 70% of the federal housing market through Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the first rule should be to do no harm. I can't say that FHFA is following that rule too clearly these days. Now is an especially crucial time for FHFA to provide stability and certainty and transparency in housing markets. American families seeking affordable housing need a safe and steady hand behind the wheel. Instead, they're getting a confused study and contrast. On the one hand, FHFA has made so-called mission activities front and center for its stated objective to, quote, promote affordable housing. And on the other hand, it's rolled out a pricing grid that would reduce affordability for credit-worthy borrowers. On the other hand, FHFA finalized a rule to require approval and public comment for the GSE's new products and activities. FHFA is supposed to promote home ownership and help first-time borrowers. In an effort to do that, they've greenlit a title insurance waiver program that has no transparency, and it's not clear that it will, instead of helping, cause harm to these borrowers. They're now considering a risky second lien. Actually have decided to move forward with a second lien proposal for existing homeowners that would essentially add more debt against a secured asset and not just expose the borrowers to problems with their own mortgages, but expose the entire mortgage-backed securities market to additional risk and potentially cause a lot of harm. If only there were a precedent to learn from. Clearly there is, in fact, precedent, and this is something we have no input from any constituency saying these second liens on mortgages is in real demand in the market. I have no one coming and saying, Congressman, as chairman of Housing and Insurance, you have to get this done. Instead, everyone's sounding the alarm. Can't we learn from the benefits of history? And they're not even following their own product development process, product approval process. So the list is long. I hope today's hearing will provide more clarity on FHFA's recent decisions. Even well-intentioned policies should not come at the expense of safety and soundness of the housing market. I look forward to hearing the testimony of both HUD and FHFA IGs. I thank you both for your work and for the opportunity for Congress to perform the essential oversight of your activities as Inspectors General. And now recognize the gentleman from Missouri, the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Cleaver, for 4 minutes for his opening comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will begin by declaring that we will never reduce or eradicate poverty until we adequately address the deficit in affordable housing. Housing is less affordable today than at any point in modern history. The lack of affordable housing has fueled a national crisis of fair and affordable housing and homelessness. HUD is on the front lines in responding to the devastating impacts of this crisis. Today, HUD helps provide decent, safe, and affordable housing to more than 4.3 million low-income families through its public housing, rental subsidy, and voucher programs. FHFA ensures the enterprises remain financially sustainable while providing market stability for renters and borrowers, especially for underserved populations and communities. Since 2008, FHFA has served as a conservator for the enterprises following their insolvency due to poor management and investment decisions, including failure to hold sufficient capital and purchases of predatory subprime mortgages. In May of 2024, FHFA issued its final Fair Lending, Fair Housing, and Equitable Housing Finance Plan rule. The Equitable Housing Finance Plans direct the enterprises to assess lending disparities in their respective portfolios and to establish a plan to enhance the availability of fair and affordable housing and mortgage lending to low to moderate income families and people of color. The rule will help increase public transparency and accountability for the enterprises and reinforce oversight of unfair and deceptive practices to FHFA's Fair Housing and Fair Lending oversight programs. This is historic work. Together, both the HUD and FHFA OIGs play critical roles in advancing the integrity, accountability, and effectiveness of HUD and FHFA, respectively, and their federal housing and finance programs. We are fortunate to have the perspective of HUD Inspector General Oliver Davis and FHFA Inspector General Brian Tomney before the subcommittee today. The HUD and FHFA OIG are both mandated to combat fraud, waste, and abuse. Contrary to claims of HUD inefficiencies, HUD under the Biden-Harris administration has worked diligently to address outstanding recommendations from OIG, including those resulting from harmful policies enacted under the Trump administration. I look forward to this exchange today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Cleaver. I now recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Housing is the #1 domestic issue and a priority for voters all across the political spectrum. When Americans spend, on average, 30 to 50% of their income on housing, it's no wonder they feel their paychecks don't go far as they should. Yet MAGA Republicans are ignoring Americans' call to build more housing and cut costs. While I value the insights of the Inspectors General here today, they cannot offer Congress legislative solutions to act on, but they don't need to either because we already know what to do. This committee needs to get serious and pass my bills, H.R. 4233, to create over 1 million affordable and accessible homes, H.R. 4232 to end homelessness, and H.R. 4231 to restore the American dream of home ownership. I thank you, I yield back, and I await the testimony of the Inspector Generals to see if they can help us create more housing. Or maybe they're here for something else, I don't know. Thank you, I yield back.
Thank the ranking member. Today we welcome the testimony of the Honorable Ray Oliver Davis, my apologies, Inspector General of the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and the Honorable Brian M. Tomney, the Inspector General for the Federal Housing Finance Agency. We thank each of you for taking time to be here today. Each of you will be recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony. Without objection, each of your written statements will be made part of the record. Mr. Davis, you're now recognized for Ms. Davis, my apologies. It does say Mr. here. Ms. Davis, my apologies. You're now recognized for 5 minutes for your oral remarks.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Davidson, Ranking Member Cleaver, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to testify about oversight of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. HUD plays a critical role in every American community, providing billions of dollars for rental assistance, preventing homelessness, disaster recovery programs, and economic development. HUD also creates important affordable housing and home ownership opportunities by ensuring trillions of dollars of mortgage loans and creating liquidity for those loans through Ginnie Mae's mortgage-backed securities program. Our country faces significant and complex challenges in the housing space today. Housing is more expensive now than ever. There is not enough affordable housing to meet the demands of American communities. Nearly all of the affordable housing stock that receives HUD funding is old and need major repairs. Economic conditions have slowed the pace of new construction and transactions that would leverage private investment to increase the affordable housing supply. Interest rates remain high and make mortgages less affordable. These conditions also create liquidity crunches for many of the independent mortgage banks that HUD relies on to service loans and provide payments to investors. There is legitimate concern about the impact that an economic downturn could have on servicers' ability to operate, and whether Ginnie Mae will have to take on the responsibility for servicing portfolios like it did in 2022 with the collapse of reverse mortgage funding. Several aspects of these challenges are not within HUD or the federal government's control. My office's oversight is focused on the things that HUD can and should control. We want to help HUD maximize the outcomes that its programs and funding generate and strengthen HUD's ability to prevent fraud, waste, and abuse that robs communities and families of the resources they need. My testimony today will highlight key areas where HUD can improve the integrity and efficiency of its operations, as well as the effectiveness of its programs in producing for the families and communities it assists. We have identified many meaningful HUD actions that can be taken, including over 30 open recommendations across its programs that we have labeled as priority recommendations. For example, in its oversight of safety hazards in assisted housing, HUD needs to ensure that property inspections are performed within required timeframes, and that complaints about health and safety risk in multifamily properties are resolved timely. HUD also needs to take action to require property owners to document their determinations not to use lead-safe work practices when performing maintenance on properties that disturbs lead-based paint, and enhance its process for monitoring how property owners correct emergency health and safety deficiencies identified during inspections. HUD also needs to act immediately to better protect employees of HUD contractors from retaliation for reporting fraud, waste, and abuse or mismanagement that affect its programs. Our office has identified that whistleblower protections extended to the employees of federal contractors in 2013 by Congress are not available for employees falling under thousands of long-term HUD contracts, HUD assistant contracts. Many whistleblowers work at the same housing providers that HUD is challenged to oversee, and they deserve the fullest protection under the law when reporting matters such as financial irregularities and specific and substantial dangers to public health and safety affecting low-income housing. Our office has also recommended HUD to do more to enhance controls that prevent fraud before it ever occurs. HUD needs to take the basic steps of identifying how programs could be defrauded and taking actions to mitigate those risks, then testing how well those controls work and taking actions to make them even stronger. HUD also needs to ensure that its over 40,000 contractors and grantee partners are held accountable for assisting in fraud detection and prevention. Similarly, HUD is chronically challenged with understanding the extent to which proper payments are made in its two largest rental assistance programs. HUD has been unable to estimate the proper amount of improper payments in these programs for the past 7 years. Funds spent in these programs total more than $45 billion in fiscal year 2023 alone. That's over 2/3 of HUD's expenditures. Estimating the improper payments is the first step to finding why they occur and creating a plan to reduce them. To conclude, I'm proud of the hard work of my dedicated staff and the robust oversight that our teams provide to our stakeholders. I am looking forward to working with this subcommittee in the future, and I'm welcome any questions that you may have.
Thanks, Ms. Davis. And Mr. Tomney, you're now recognized for 5 minutes for your opening statement and oral remarks.
Thank you. Chairman Davidson, Ranking Member Cleaver, and honored members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear today to talk about the meaningful work that my office is doing for the benefit of the American homeowners. I am honored to appear with my distinguished colleague, Ray Oliver Davis, Inspector General of the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Although each of our agencies have a unique mission and different work streams, we share many of the same oversight goals. It has been a little over 2 years since I became the FHFA Inspector General in early 2022. During that time, we have issued more than 60 reports covering topics such as enterprise supervision and conservatorship, the Federal Home Loan Bank System, non-bank seller servicers, business resiliency, appraisals, and the crucial area of cybersecurity. Our findings largely demonstrate that FHFA is achieving better administrative and management results in maturing as an agency and a regular. At the same time, we have identified areas where the agency can improve and continue to progress. In those cases, we have offered recommendations, all of which the agency has committed to implement. In addition to the work of our report teams, our investigators play a significant role in protecting the nation's mortgage markets through civil and criminal investigations of mortgage fraud and other financial crimes. We routinely partner with investigators from HUD and FDIC OIGs, the FBI, and federal and state law enforcement agencies. Our investigations often focus on fraud involving loan originations and modifications, short sales, and residential mortgage-backed securities, or RMBS. We also continue to investigate pandemic fraud, often schemes that targeted the Paycheck Protection Program. Here we have seen fraudsters use illegally obtained PPP loans to take out millions in fraudulent mortgages and steal from multiple Federal Home Loan Bank member banks. In the past 2 years, our Office of Investigations has reported more than 150 convictions or pleas and more than $2.2 billion in criminal and civil penalties. In 2023, our investigators, working with other federal law enforcement partners, played a pivotal role in the resolution of one of the last cases from the financial crisis. Investment bank and financial services company UBS agreed to pay almost $1.5 billion in penalties to settle a civil action relating to underwriting and issuing RMBS in 2006 and 2007. And just a few months ago, we also completed one of the largest PPP conspiracy cases up to now. After more than 2 years of complex work, 17 conspirators were sentenced for their roles in fraudulently obtaining and laundering millions in forgivable PPP loans. My team and I also take allegations of fraud against vulnerable people seriously. And when we have the jurisdiction to pursue justice for the victims, we are committed to doing so. In one recent example, we investigated and supported the prosecution of 3 co-conspirators in a $7 million fraud scheme that targeted vulnerable people. This included elderly homeowners in financial distress who were just trying to stay in their homes. Sadly, although the fraudsters were found guilty and sentenced to 6, 10, and 25 years, all of the victims still lost their homes. Looking towards the future, our reporting will continue to focus on areas of highest risk. Whenever appropriate, we will offer actionable recommendations to improve FHFA's operations and oversight. Some of this work will build on findings in previous reports. Some will represent an expanded facet of oversight. I look forward to sharing the results of this work with you in the future. And while I cannot comment on our ongoing investigations, I can assure you that we remain vigilant in investigating and prosecuting fraud that affects our nation's housing finance system. In all of our work, we remained focused on our mission. I thank the subcommittee for the opportunity to testify today, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Tomney, for your opening statement. We'll now turn to member questions. I recognize myself for 5 minutes for questioning. Ms. Oliver Davis, I want to thank you for highlighting in your opening remarks the whistleblower protections that are out there. And just last month, we had hearings where 2 of our witnesses were basically driven out of public housing authorities for basically blowing the whistle on the things that are going wrong there. So thank you for highlighting that. I just want to know, about the Hatch Act. You know, the Biden administration issued an executive order to have every federal agency engage in voter registration. Is voter registration part of the HUD mission?
Thank you for that question, Mr. Chairman. In reference to the Hatch Act, normally we would turn over allegations around the Hatch Act to the Office of Special Counsel, and I haven't seen any guidance out on that in the department as of yet.
I don't think you'll see any coming from the administration about it this time, but frankly, in the past, inspectors general have held people from both parties liable for violations of the Hatch Act. In fact, you know, that's happened just as recently as the last administration within HUD. So I would ask that you take a look at Hatch Act, particularly with respect to voter registration drives and the potential for ballot harvesting drop boxes at HUD properties. Could you do that?
I'm happy to look into that issue and find out more about it.
And I think it lies pretty well outside the mission of housing and urban development. So I really appreciate that. You know, one of the things that I've introduced a bill, as I mentioned, a bipartisan commission to review HUD's organization, to make recommendation for needed reforms. I think we can all agree, given the state of public housing, the gaps in overseeing billions of dollars of grants and overall delays, conditions in the public housing units, and frankly, actual crime that thankfully is being prosecuted by the Department of Justice. The HUD is not functioning as efficiently or effectively as the American people expect them to. If we could get this commission enacted, would you agree to work with the commission to the maximum extent possible to help in the evaluation of this?
I'd be happy to meet with the commission and learn how our oversight could be impactful, yes.
Yeah, thank you. We're hoping to get that commission funded through appropriations and across the finish line. But it's got 2 members from each party. They can't cut spending. They can't launch new stuff. But they could refine the current programs and update the authorizations, which is a big issue within HUD. And Mr. Tomney, I want to thank you for highlighting the conservatorship issues. One of the deficiencies in the current administration is they've not delivered a report that is required by law to say what is the plan to end conservatorship, and that hasn't happened for quite a long time. Now, the Secretary of Treasury is responsible for delivering the report, but of course, the people that would be involved in it are the GSEs themselves within FHFA. Have you seen any activity working towards fulfilling that legal obligation?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. Obviously, the conservatorship topic has been one for virtually 16 years now. That has a lot of complexity to it.
Almost old enough to be an adult, but are they complying with the law that says, give us a plan? Have you seen any activity going on that says they're working towards that?
I have not seen anything. We have done some work in that space from our oversight perspective to confirm that that FHFA itself, as it relates to conservatorship decisions, is for the most part properly documenting their decision-making process while they're in conservatorship.
Yeah, thank you. And I just ask you to give attention to that because it's a statutory obligation. And I sent you a letter in advance of this hearing questioning FHFA's use of the so-called new product rule. Fannie and Freddie are required by statute and by regulation to gain the approval of the director of FHFA before introducing any new product, something that's incredibly important. And recently, Director Thompson used new products rule to approve risky, unnecessary programs to allow Freddie Mac to purchase second mortgages. They've also used it to kind of change the mandate and mission of the Federal Home Loan Bank. So do you think that the 30-day public comment period is enough, and are they complying with it?
Thank you. Thank you for your letter last week and your thoughts that you expressed in it. I'm certainly familiar with both of the recent new products that have been approved as well as the recent rule. We've not done any work yet in that space. We're currently going through our risk assessment process now to plan for future products moving forward. And to the extent that we evaluate the space, we'll certainly be able to consider that.
They seem to be timed very selectively ahead of like the State of the Union or a presidential debate or something like that. There's not demand from the public. There's not a comment period where they could weigh in and say, this is a bad idea. So I would ask you to give attention to that. And the other part is there are pipelines in the process. There are products begging for approval that have been in the process for years, and they can't get a decision out of FHFA. So it's very selective. I don't think they're complying with the new product rule, and I'd ask you to look at that. My time's expired. I'd now like to recognize the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver, who's also the chair of the subcommittee, the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Housing, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Davis, is registering voters a political act? I mean, I know telling residents in public housing how to vote is, but the registration part.
Congressman, I'm not sure I can be helpful in this area. I don't really have all the facts. I don't have expertise in this particular area to offer. I'm happy to listen to the subcommittee member's concerns on this and learn more if I can.
I'm not concerned. Having lived in public housing, I know I don't ever remember my parents going up to the office to get a ballot on how to vote. But the other issue, the Biden-Harris administration inherited 1,733 recommendations left open and unaddressed by the previous administration. This past March, the administration had closed 253 OIG recommendations, reducing the total number of open recommendations to 820. And as HUD continues to implement the OIG's recommendations, substantial investments are needed to strengthen its programs and oversight capabilities. Do you agree with the fact that resources are needed to address the problems that have been exposed?
We have identified and we've tried to reflect that in our top management challenges report this year. The capacity is a major concern for the department. Capacity in terms of skill sets, people, resources, technology. Certainly, they need additional capacity to hold their program partners accountable.
When the HUD secretary was here, she spoke publicly about, and I've spoken with her about this privately, that many of the things that the department receives criticism for not having done, and the directions to get certain things done are simply beyond the capacity of HUD with the current allotment from Congress. So, Mr. Tomney, I know the OIG's office doesn't get into the congressional prerogative of the funding. However, if the recommendations from you continue to pile up, isn't that going to create do damage to HUD ever catching up with all the recommendations?
We've certainly taken that into account as we start new work. We have, I mean, the same can be said of frankly, my resources in my portfolio. There is an enormous program that we have to oversee. So we have to risk-base our work. We have to make sure that we get the critical parts of HUD's portfolio and make very smart, very focused recommendations. Things like Ginnie Mae with a $1 trillion portfolio, we were in the past pretty much focused just on the financial audit. We now have an audit team that looks primarily at Ginnie Mae. So we are trying to be very good stewards of our resources and make very good recommendations.
Yeah, and I agree that as the recommendations go unaddressed because they're not the dollars for HUD to address them, the same thing applies to the OIG, doesn't it?
It does. We can always do more with more, Soar, and there's always more to do, frankly.
Does your office also monitor issues that tenants may be raising? Issues. I mean, do you look into tenants organizations, welfare rights organizations who also registered concerns and raise issues?
Well, first and foremost, we certainly have a hotline, and we get a remarkable amount of input and outreach from tenants. We've also been doing community outreach. Just yesterday, I was out in D.C. with the D.C. U.S. Attorney meeting with community groups which we in hope will touch tenants and get to tenants, talking about our initiatives, our lead initiatives, our sexual misconduct initiatives out in housing. So we are taking into account tenants and meeting quite a bit with individuals that can speak directly to their concerns.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Cleaver. Floor votes have been called. We will try to get through a few more rounds of questions, and that is the intention for the committee to recess to allow members to vote and immediately resume the hearing as soon as these votes are finished. With that, I recognize the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Norman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for appearing today. I think your comment about the importance of correcting the mismanagement and I guess fraud that's within the division. Both of you, question for both of you, what do we need to do in Congress to speed up the process? And I noticed you had commitments that they were going to improve or I guess look into the complaints. What kind of timetable and what kind of, I guess, ramifications if they do not comply?
Congressman, are we talking about open recommendations? Yes. One thing that we have done at HUD OIG is we have really focused in on priority recommendations. As other members have cited, we have a large number of recommendations that we've made to the department. So what we try to do is really focus on the ones that can make the most difference. I would draw the subcommittee's attention to those things like elevated blood levels in children in public housing, things like IT concerns over security when there's PII at risk. In terms of the recommendations, we have a process that we follow internally, and sometimes that process leads to agreement and sometimes it leads to disagreement. One thing that I am very much hoping to do as the head of my agency is be in control of the closure of those recommendations. I want to be in the position to look at what HUD is doing and say whether or not they have satisfied my recommendation. That's something I don't necessarily have the authority to do right now.
Thank you for the question. Obviously, there's a scale difference between HUD and FHFA as far as our open recommendations. As of just yesterday, we were only at 42, which within the last 2 years that I've taken office, the FHFA has closed 98, and of that, about half of those were ones that had been recommended during my tenure. Director Thompson came to me early on her own and acknowledged the open recommendations and had committed to me that she was working to close them and implement them as quickly as possible. So by and large, I've been pleased with the response that we've gotten from the agency, and certainly nobody on my staff has raised any particular concerns. So we're working to close them as fast as possible. Some are easier than others. Some could be just a quick update of training to a certain group of people. Others could involve IT infrastructure changes that will just take time. But all in all, I've been pleased with the closure pace in my agency.
So they're not only giving you responses, they're giving you actions that are correcting the recommendations to make the agency better?
Correct. So the process is once we make a recommendation, it is on FHFA to then implement that. Once FHFA believes that they have fully implemented it, they reach back out to the team, the audit team, or the evaluation team that made the recommendation. We make the determination of whether they satisfy that recommendation. And once they do, we then close the recommendation as implemented.
Okay, Congressman Davidson mentioned the Hatch Act. What's literally taking place is at pretty much every government agencies, they're giving out voter registration forms. And I'm from South Carolina, we're checking into, are these illegals? A lot of them, the federal government under Biden is giving Social Security numbers, giving driver's licenses. So basically it's a registration to vote when it's illegal on the face of it. We're looking into that now. Are you aware of this, and do you condone this?
I have certainly not seen that. I have certainly seen the Hatch Act warnings from my office come out to remind folks about to be mindful of it, particularly in an election year, but I have not seen this in my office, and it's not been an issue that's been raised to me.
Sir, I'm not aware of it as well. And likewise for my colleague, we train on the Hatch Act internally, we discuss it, but I'm not aware of this activity. I'm not.
Okay, thank you for your time, and hopefully we can, I'm in the home building business. I don't know what affordable housing is anymore. And it's particularly with where we are with the providing housing for the illegal aliens, we've got a problem all over this country, affordability problem. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Mr. Norman. I now recognize the gentleman from California, Ms. Waters, who's also the ranking member of the full committee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to direct this question to Ms. Ray Oliver Davis. I'm looking at an article from the Washington Post, July 28, 2019, and it's where President Trump characterized Representative Elijah Cummings' Baltimore-based congressional district as a rodent-infested mess where no human would want to live. And also, I'm looking at the fact that the president just a few days ago made a similar statement about Baltimore, and it appears that the Kushner family owned thousands of apartments that were considered rat-infested and other kinds of problems. Do you know whether or not those rat-infested apartments owned by Mr. Kushner are still in Baltimore?
I can't speak to those specific properties or the specific units.
I can't hear you.
I cannot speak to those specific properties or those specific units.
Have you had complaints about rat-infested apartments in Baltimore, Maryland, or in Virginia that were owned by Mr. Kushner or his family?
I would need to do some internal data gathering to verify whether or not we have in fact had complaints about that.
The president just a few days ago said it was a mess. It was terrible. Have you thought about looking into it since the former president said that it was a mess, Baltimore was a mess?
We have a pretty robust portfolio in terms of decent, safe, and sanitary issues involving public housing and HUD-assisted housing, and we're always looking to hear about more issues. We're certain they're out there.
How long have you been Inspector General?
Since the beginning of 2019.
And have you conducted any investigations on rat-infested apartments in Virginia or in Baltimore?
We have, again, a remarkable portfolio in this area. I can't speak to specifics on rats or mold, although we do hear about that quite a bit nationwide. That's not an unusual complaint that we would get. We are looking at unit conditions across the board, voucher programs that are participating. We're looking at unit conditions in specific properties, RAD conversions. We're certainly in the PHA space and multifamily, so we're doing a lot of work.
Did the former president's comments catch your attention just a few days ago and give you cause to want to take a look and see what was happening in this place he called a mess, this city?
Frankly, you're raising my awareness to those comments today. I hear comments daily that are extremely concerning to me about the state of HUD housing and specific landlords and PHAs. So
Is it unusual to hear about a city that's a mess who maybe have apartments that are participating in federal resources and that would cause you to take a look, and particularly if the accusation came from high places?
I understand the sense of urgency around this, and we are paying attention daily to what we read and hear, and I'm happy to keep dialoguing with you on this, absolutely.
And so, if in fact any of these rat-infested apartments are owned by the Kushner family, would you be hesitant to investigate them and take a look because of whom they belong to?
We're not hesitant to look into any allegations, especially in this arena. That's not how we operate. We're completely independent, and it does not, those things do not factor in.
Have you ever followed up on rat-infested apartments,
In general?
anywhere?
In general, I think it's a pretty common thing that we hear about, frankly, in the course of our audits and investigations. It's not unusual.
The reason I raise these questions is because when we deal with housing, we find that so many people are undermined, taken care of. We find that people in high places don't get investigated, that we know about thousands of apartments in this country that are infected, where nothing is going on from any inspector generals. And it sounds as if you don't know anything about what you do with rat-infested apartments owned by anybody. Is that right?
Well, when it comes to those type of allegations, we reflect them in our audit work. We talk about how HUD is responding to those type of things. Like, for instance, we have done 2 audits recently talking about how HUD is dealing with both life-threatening situations and non-life-threatening
The
situations.
gentlelady's time has expired. It is now time for members to make their way to the floor. As a reminder, we will immediately resume the hearing after votes. The committee stands in recess. The Committee on Housing and Insurance will come to order. I now recognize the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Fitzgerald, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to go quickly here, so bear with me. I'm sure you're aware the Administrative Procedure Act defines a rule as an agency statement that is, quote, of general or particular applicability and future effect, and designed to implement, interpret, or prescribe law or policy. FHFA's buy merge requirement would affect participants in the housing finance market. It also is a major change in policy from the longstanding tri-merge requirement. I'm concerned that under Director Thompson's leadership, the FHFA seems to be hiding kind of behind their role as the conservator of Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac to skirt requirements of APA. Mr. Tomney, does your office have any plans to investigate the FHFA and is following, whether or not they're following APA with its policy change announcements?
Thank you for the question. We have not done work in that specific space. As I said to the chairman earlier today, we are currently engaged in our risk analysis leading into future products. And so hearing from stakeholders like yourself today is certainly something we'll be looking at, and happy to work with you, and stay tuned.
Thank you. Former Director Mark Calabria issued a proposed rule of prior approval for enterprise products, proposed rule that was subsequently finalized by Director Thompson. This rule is an important guardrail, as you know, to ensure that the GSEs do not inappropriately expand their footprint in the housing market and displace true private capital. FHFA recent 2023 report to Congress noted that between April 28, 2023 and April 28, 2024, during that year, FHFA completed its review of 10 new activities and, based on factors set forth in the regulation, determined the 3 should be treated as new products that merit public notice and comment. Do you plan to issue a report assessing compliance with prior approval for enterprise products final rule?
It's certainly something we're looking at. We've not made that decision yet, but I'm certainly familiar with the topic that you're speaking about, and is going to be a continued topic for us moving forward.
And last Friday, the FHFA conditionally approved a pilot for Freddie Mac to purchase closed-end second mortgages, a proposal that I guess you could say was opposed by members of Congress and the industry and some consumer groups as well. Will you issue a report on the pilot to determine whether the objectives of the pilot were met and that FHFA fully adhered to the regulation?
Thank you. It's certainly something we're considering and we'll be speaking about in the coming weeks ahead as we plan our future products.
IG audits of the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program have determined that the time to deliver program funds to grant recipients varied greatly between 01 and 2022 and trended upwards. This funding has always been implemented pursuant to appropriations language, which makes changes to the underlying CDBG statutory requirements. To Ms. Davis, how does the discrepancy between CDBG requirements and appropriations language affect the timeline for allocating CDBG direct funds?
Well, thank you for that question. I think the complications with CDBG-DR are the simple fact that the program does not have permanent authorization, so it doesn't have as much predictability. We have long sought permanent authorization. We've seen progress. We've had our previous 2 secretaries, both former Secretary Carson and former Secretary Fudge, endorse that, say they support permanent authorization. We've seen progress at the department. They now have a consolidated notice that they issue. Sometimes grantees are looking at multiple notices at any given time while in the process of having an urgent need, trying to execute funds, trying to build capacity.
How could they make that process more efficient?
Permanent authorization would certainly help. It would certainly help with the timeliness and the deliverability of the funds. It would.
What do you think about state and local governments taking on a larger share of the mitigation?
Well, we need to make sure we're ensuring that there are proper monitoring and help. We're assisting the subrecipients, because it never just stops with the grantees. It goes. This is a very decentralized process.
Very good. Last year, the FHFA undertook a comprehensive review of the federal home loan banks, calling it the first such review in over 90-year history of the FHLB system. A statement that kind of ignores the multiple times that Congress has reviewed and made statutory changes to the system, but we're kind of used to that, I guess, in Congress. The report calls for several changes to the system, including to its mission and usage. Has the Inspector General, Mr. Tomney, has the Inspector General reviewed the FHFA's mandate to make such changes absent clear congressional directives to do so?
Thank you for the question. I'm certainly familiar with the report.
The gentleman's time's expired, and I asked to respond in writing for the question.
Yeah, very good. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. The gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Tlaib, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I want to talk about lead exposure within HUD. And so, Inspector General Davis, you know, we have a saying in my district, you know, child can't learn if they're hungry, but also a child really can't learn, can't thrive if they're being poisoned, being exposed to lead and so much more. In Detroit, I know 90% of the housing stock was constructed before 1980, and only that's only about 2 years after lead-based paint was banned. And as of 2020, we've learned that more than 1 in 20 children in Detroit tested positive for elevated lead levels. So this is an issue of all types of housing, even in the private industry, where I think it's like 20% of private housing units alone have also lead-based hazards. So, Inspector General Davis, can you discuss, you know, some of your recommendations? Because even though the Biden administration has announced, you know, tremendous amount of investment in lead abatement, implementation matters. And we just haven't seen it on the ground. And so can you discuss some of the recommendations OIG has had for HUD in terms of lead-based hazards in public housing?
Well, thank you so much for drawing attention to this issue. This is part of my environmental justice initiative that I released last year. We've been working very closely with the Department of Justice. They've actually included us in their environmental justice policy. We've been working so closely over time now. In terms of lead, we've made a number of priority recommendations that remain open that we think will make a difference. You know, first and foremost, we want the department to get their arms around the problem. We want them to understand the number of units that might potentially have lead, and that's so that they can adequately resource their oversight of that issue. We're also looking at some of the tools they have in place to track elevated blood lead levels like you're talking about. They have a tool in place, but we know there are variances in it. For instance, we see EBLLs concentrated in certain states, but we know that, to your point, that housing stock is old throughout the country. So it would be unusual to see just certain states have a higher level of EBLLs. So we think they need to address that issue. We're also—
Did you look at the capital fund formula at all as well?
I'm sorry?
Capital fund formula grants? Have you, go ahead and finish your thought, because I do want to talk to you about that, because even when we do find it, right? I mean,
Yes.
we're great at studying and finding out that there's a problem. But I know for HUD estimates, I think addressing any health hazards in public housing is about $15,000 per unit. But the capital fund formula grant program are less than 25% of that amount on average.
Anything that we can do to combat this problem, I'd be willing to talk to you further about, certainly.
Yeah, I think that's something to look at, because again, we can keep throwing money at it because we know there's a problem, but on the ground, the way we're doing it, I don't know if it's actually been effective. Switching gears for just a moment, Inspector General Tomney, FHFA is responsible for ensuring enterprises and FHA banks operate in a safe and sound manner. Climate-related risks impact the enterprise and FHL bank mortgage loan portfolios investments. For example, the CBO estimates that homes with federally backed mortgages already face an annual flood damage of $9.4 billion. I mean, I saw one of my neighbors, very small neighborhood in my community, being flooded almost 4 times just in one summer. So has FHFA made progress on recommended actions to incorporate climate-related risks with what you've looked at?
Thank you for the question. We've certainly looked at sort of the disaster risk portfolio for some time now. We've issued a white paper on the topic. We're actually conducting a review right now of the flood insurance to ensure that both Fannie and Freddie are ensuring that properties within a flood zone have the proper insurance. So that is underway right now, and happy to report on that in the coming months.
When you all review, is flood mapping something you look at?
We do not. Our auditors and evaluators will ensure that.
It's still connected, though, Inspector General. I mean, when you talk about access to insurance, one of the things that I hear from my constituents is the flood maps for that FEMA uses is so outdated.
What's interesting is that historically, Fannie and Freddie, because of the mandatory flood insurance, have not had a lot of exposure. Their risk tends to lie elsewhere. But I think as flood zones change and need to be reconsidered, there could be more risk in the future there.
Thank you both.
Thank the gentlewoman. The gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Flood, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to start with FHFA's approval of a couple of potentially worrying pilot programs. The FHFA's approval of Freddie Mac's proposal to purchase second mortgages and the Fannie Mae title acceptance pilot are both potentially problematic ways of pushing the GSEs into other private markets that have nothing to do with their core mission. As we know, inspectors general are not necessarily in a policy-making role, but they are a good source of oversight, and in some cases, we have questions about whether FHFA is following its own rules. In a Senate banking hearing, Director Thompson indicated that the pilot did not have to go through the products rule because it was a quote-unquote credit underwriting decision. Mr. Tomney, could the OIG review instances where FHFA bypassed the prior approval for enterprise products rule by labeling a GSE program simply a quote-unquote credit underwriting decision?
Thank you for the question. We've not looked at that, particularly since the new rule was finalized last year. We're currently going through our process to plan new products in the coming months and towards the end of the year. And this topic is one I'm familiar with, and we're certainly going to keep talking about it.
Well, thank you. It would be exceptionally unnerving if the FHFA could use this quote-unquote credit underwriting decision excuse to avoid compliance with new products rule. Frankly, you could classify any number of activities as related to credit underwriting. Where does the loophole end is one of my questions. The GSEs are already housing behemoths that have their hands in all parts of our housing ecosystem. If they're able to offer new products without even going through the new products rule, then we're going to see them continue to expand. Everyone in this committee is well aware that the GSEs are not fully private entities. They are still in conservatorship. If they are interested in expanding into new markets, they should be spun out of conservatorship first. They cannot have their cake and eat it too by remaining in place with implicit federal backing and also cannibalize existing markets that have nothing to do with their charter. Neither the pilot nor the second mortgage pilot have anything to do with expanding access to housing or affordable housing. In fact, the second mortgage pilot could run directly contrary to those goals by speeding up inflationary pressures that are already making our housing market incredibly expensive. I'd like to briefly pivot to HUD. Last month, we had 2 witnesses testify regarding waste and fraud at the public housing authorities. In both cases, the people that came to testify in front of the committee experienced retaliation for telling their stories. My understanding is that Congress already passed a law protecting against this kind of retaliation for contractors, subcontractors, grantees, and subgrantees. That statute is Title 41, Section 4712 of the United States Code. Ms. Davis, would public housing authorities which receive federal appropriations be subject to those protections from reprisal?
Yes, they should be. They should fall under 4712 as employees of a grantee.
I know there's been an issue with amending contracts before and after the passage of this law in 2013. In the case of our witnesses last month, one was actually hired well after the 2013 cutoff. That individual indicated they were not aware of any whistleblower protections in place for them. For someone, particularly someone who is not a federal employee, how are they made aware that these anti-reprisal rules apply to them?
That should fall within the responsibility of the department as the contractual relationship and the grantee relationship stands.
Okay. Do you have any data on how many times the OIG office has actually pursued a legitimate whistleblower anti-reprisal claim? Like how many times has an investigation resulted in a successful outcome for the whistleblower?
I don't have that data. That said, I'm certain the committee knows how important whistleblowers are, both to you, to your constituents, certainly to every IG in their work. And so we've reflected the limitations that we have with the HAP contracts in the recent management alert. But I don't have the specific data about the numbers for you.
All right, thank you very much. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. The gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Garcia, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank both of the witnesses for being here today, and thank you for your good work. I want to start by first clarifying some of the comments that were made earlier by some of my colleagues. It didn't surprise me that both of you were not aware of any Hatch Act, direct Hatch Act violations at public housing or properties owned or financed by your organizations. And it didn't surprise me that you weren't aware of any harvesting of any voters. It seems to be something that the Secretary of State of Mississippi said in response to the president's recent executive order. And in fact, he was afraid, he said, of, well, I'm not going to use the word, I call them undocumented immigrants. Others use some inhumane terms that begin with I, and also convicted felons. Are you all, either one of you, aware, and just a yes or no, I don't want to hear about expertise or anything, just yes or no. Are you aware of any allegations or complaints having been made to any one of your agencies, either directly or indirectly, about voter fraud or voter harvesting or Hatch Act violations?
No.
No.
No. Well, I'm not surprised because I'm not sure that anybody can cite any. Certainly this Secretary of State didn't, but obviously it's gotten some of my colleagues' attention. The other one that struck me was that someone suggested that Biden, referring to the President of the United States, was going around handing out voter cards, again, to undocumented immigrants and handing out driver's licenses. Are you all aware of that happening at all at any one of your facilities?
No.
No.
Well, I'm sure you're not, because in fact, President Biden can't hand out driver's licenses. That is something that the states do. It's a privilege to drive in these states, and it's up to the states, so the president has nothing to do with it. And certainly, I don't think anyone would intentionally give an unauthorized immigrant, knowing that they're not citizens, a voter registration card. I mean, that is against all rules, or at least the rules in my state, in Texas. So it seems to me that all this is just a lot of nonsense to distract from the real housing crisis and the affordable housing crisis that's going around in America. But the last thing I did want to clarify is that my colleagues need to remember that the Housing and Community Development Act of 1980 does allow eligible mixed status families to apply for housing. And again, it's mixed status families. In other words, someone has to be a citizen to apply. So I just want to make sure that we don't mix apples and oranges here. But the housing crisis really is about affordability. And it's important that people that are eligible for any of this housing are people that are, of course, first eligible, because then hopefully it helps us with the prices on other housing. Because I know in Harris County, where I live, Hispanic homeownership has grown by 47% since 2010. However, Black homeownership has been declining. So that too is a very serious issue. The affordability gap in this area alone has grown by 275%. So it's not getting better, it's getting worse. And that's what we should be focused on. In my county, the affordability is benchmarked by affordable for someone earning household of $100,000 a year. Get real. That's not really the average person, at least not in my district. So what are we doing to promote equitable access to home ownership for prospective home buyers? And I'll start with you, ma'am.
Well, HUD has a number of ways that they're encouraging home ownership. Certainly, FHA extends access to credit to eligible lenders, and they have some policies they have rolled out in order to encourage home ownership. What we do in our oversight is look at the eligibility requirements and ensure that they're being met so that they don't put the fund at risk. We have made priority recommendations on large group of loans, things like individuals that have delinquent tax debt, individuals who perhaps are subject to a federal offset because of child support. And we think that's a way to protect the fund, and that's the way to help the department to continue to extend access to eligible homeowners, like you said. They also do counseling before and after the purchase of a home. We have some ongoing work there to see if we can judge the performance of that counseling that HUD offers and how well it serves the individuals, and if they have performance goals around that and whether or not they're being met. We have grants, certainly, that are being extended. Puerto Rico Home Buyers Program is one that encourages home ownership.
The gentlewoman's time's expired. I'd ask Ms. Oliver Davis just respond further in writing if you'd like to continue to follow up. Thank the gentlewoman from Texas. And
Thank you.
now, another gentlelady from Texas, Ms. De La Cruz, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. I do appreciate it. I welcome today's hearing as part of this committee's effort to restore consistent and annual oversight of our nation's housing regulators. This oversight is critical to ensuring the agencies under our jurisdiction focus solely on their core missions. In line with our committee's 50-0 vote in support of my legislation, H.R. 7280, which is the HUD Transparency Act, I continue to advocate for the passage of this important piece of bipartisan legislation. And what it does is it requires the Inspector General to testify before Congress annually. And you are aware of it. And although it's not in place right now, I really appreciate your appearance today before us. So thank you for coming before us. Ms. Oliver Davis and Mr. Tomney, earlier this year, we had the former HUD secretary before this committee, and a lot of this was brought up concerning waste, fraud, and abuse. And the HUD secretary made a statement that really disturbed me. And what she said was, in part, I quote, "I wish someone would tell me where the waste, fraud, and abuse is." Wow. I think the work you've both published tells the former secretary exactly where and how much misconduct has taken place and is currently taking place. So my question to both of you is quite simple. What role do whistleblowers play in the work that you do to uncover this waste, fraud, and abuse? And we'll start with Mr. Tomney.
Thank you for the question. Whistleblowers and people coming forth are very important to us. We have our hotline that receives dozens and hundreds of tips throughout the year. There's all types of different mechanisms for folks, including hearings like this, to be educated on exactly what an OIG does. And so it's very important. Our Office of Investigations has done great work in following the fraud, waste, and abuse that's been reported.
And Ms. Oliver Davis, do you agree with his statement?
Oh, certainly. They are essential to us. They see and hear things that we simply can't.
So would you say that the HUD secretary was aware of these statements, of the things that they've seen and have reported back?
I know that the department is aware of whistleblowers, and I know they're aware of the importance of whistleblowers in our work. We issued a management alert recently stating that employees of contractors that serve under HAP contracts are not being recognized for potential protections under the Whistleblower Act in HUD. So that's something that we're raising awareness within the department. It's something that's very important.
But
it's
it would be fair.
recommendation.
It would be fair to say that the HUD secretary would be aware that there is waste, fraud, and abuse. Correct?
I believe so. I believe so. That's right.
Thank you. With that, Ms. Oliver Davis, along those lines, I also want to bring up a management report that you issued to the then Deputy Secretary and now Acting Secretary Todman in May of 2023, after the HUD OIG identified that there was a significant gap in whistleblower protections for contractor employees pre-2013 that do not include congressionally enacted anti-retaliation provisions referred to as Section 4712. Could you tell us some of the recommendations that you have for this?
Yes, absolutely. One of the recommendations we have is that the department get their arms around the scope of this problem. We identified it in the context of HAP contracts. There are thousands. I'm fearful that perhaps this is also a present problem throughout HUD's portfolio, but we're asking HUD to attend to that and to let us know. We're also asking HUD to go to their partners that have these contracts in place and ask them to consent to amend the contract to protect the very contract employees that they're employing.
Thank you. I yield my time.
Thank you, Ms. Dela Cruz. The gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Horsford, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you to the chairman and to the ranking member, and thank you to our witnesses for appearing to discuss your work today. Your offices are crucial as we continue to work to address the glaring lack of safe, clean, and most importantly, affordable housing throughout the country. In my home state of Nevada, we are bearing the brunt of this country's affordable housing crisis as low-income renters in Las Vegas and Southern Nevada face the most severe shortage in the country. There are only 13 affordable and available rental homes for every 100 households living in Southern Nevada, according to the National Low-Income Housing Coalition's 2024 GAP report. During the current shortage of available housing, the most vulnerable are compelled to compete for this severely limited supply, which leads to seniors and working families having to pay nearly half of their monthly income on rent. At the same time, those payments do not go nearly as far as they used to for folks who are looking to own their own homes. Since 2022, the average monthly mortgage payment throughout Southern Nevada has increased an astounding 47%. At events all across my district, I hear from constituents really across the entire income distribution who are struggling to find a way to put a roof over their head and to know that that priority is important to all of us and to HUD. The work that your offices undertake is vital to that mission, as your oversight ensures that we are maximizing the efficiency of every dollar that we spend to enhance our nation's affordable housing stock. Additionally, I want to applaud your recent efforts on prioritizing tenant safety and keeping a close eye on properties' ability to handle emergency repairs, which will ensure that people are not just housed, but that they can do so with dignity. However, before we can even get to that point, we need to have a data-driven understanding of how to best efficiently deploy the limited resources that we invest in affordable housing. That's why my legislation, the Housing Market Transparency Act, would empower HUD to collect and centralize tenant-focused data such as habitability standards, as well as the most recent inspection data for HUD-assisted properties. Inspector General Davis, would you please discuss some of the strategies that your team would be better able to implement to mitigate potential hazards and address inefficiencies if HUD kept a centralized repository for this health and safety information from state housing agencies?
Well, you've touched on a very problem part of HUD's portfolio in rental assistance. We are looking constantly not only at the lack of units available and the vouchers that go unused, but also, as you pointed out, the safe and sanitary issues that seem to permeate HUD's portfolio. We are looking not only at HUD's oversight with respect to each of these and making recommendations, but we're actually looking beyond HUD at the grantee level, looking at living conditions within each of the program areas.
And what other data points would you recommend HUD begin collecting to inform your efforts to provide safe housing and to continue HUD's efforts around tenant protections?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, we still don't have an accurate count of lead and how it affects the housing portfolio. We don't actually know where lead is in the portfolio, and lead's a huge problem, of course, for our young people under 6. I think we're talking a lot about voucher utilization. That's a big thing. You know, we've learned that the VASH program, the PHAs are having some difficulty making sure the vouchers are utilized to the best of their ability to see that our veterans are housed. HUD is working on optimizing the voucher program in general. I think we need to look beyond those efforts at the performance of that program, the long term, and see how it's serving the public.
I just wanted to close by also raising that my bill would also address collecting information around consumer lending data. And I want to commend the ranking member, Mr. Cleaver, because he and I led a letter demanding answers to reporting that the Navy Federal Credit Union had engaged in potentially discriminatory lending practices by approving Black applicants at significantly lower rates. I know we're still working to fully underscore the racial impact of that, and I hope that my colleagues on this committee would join with us and co-sponsor the Housing Market Transparency Act. It's good legislation. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Horsford. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Lawler, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Housing affordability is a serious crisis in our nation right now. We are over 6.5 million units underbuilt at the moment, with mortgage rates at multi-decade highs, limited supply, and continued supply chain and construction issues. For many, it is the most difficult time to purchase a home in a generation. These, among other factors, have forced many potential home buyers into the rental market, driving up rental demand and prices with it. At such a critical time, and with so many families struggling to get by, so many vulnerable and low-income Americans are relying on access to decent, safe, and sanitary housing from public housing authorities. And that is why your offices are so crucial, and it is so important to have you here today and to make sure your work is being seen. It's horrifying, but so important to be hearing of these instances of waste, fraud, corruption, and abuse, and issues causing HUD's inability to provide decent, safe, and sanitary housing. The New York City Housing Authority is by far the largest public housing authority in the nation, consisting of almost 180,000 apartments. As such, it received over $2.8 billion of federal funding in 2023 through a range of different federal programs. NYCHA has a long history of mismanagement and corruption, which has created unsafe and unacceptable living conditions for thousands of residents. Inspector General Oliver Davis, I mentioned last year when you appeared here that I was pleased to see the role you and your team played in the arrest of 70 current and former and NYCHA employees for a variety of offenses as part of one of the largest pay-to-play schemes in history. Following up on that, what actions can HUD take to further compel NYCHA to make serious and sustainable reforms?
Well, we have a whole host of priority recommendations in our portfolio that apply to PHAs in general, which would also apply to NYCHA. They need to hold NYCHA accountable in that way. They need to work with the monitor who's in place to get data on the present circumstances and then hold their feet to the fire with those outstanding recommendations. I also think as we go forward, the implementation of Inspire, while is good in theory, we will all be anxious to see how it rolls out and to see if it does answer all these problems that are known in the public housing arena.
And what lessons can we learn from the failures of NYCHA to prevent similar corruption and lawlessness at other housing authorities?
You know, I think fraud risk management is something that we have been doing a lot of work in, and we are in fact in the process of doing a fraud risk management audit at NYCHA. Certainly, PHAs need some flexibilities, but they have to have some controls in place, and they have to have some guardrails that people can't push through. I'm hoping that that audit will be very beneficial, certainly to NYCHA and to other PHAs.
So to that end, obviously in addition to the rampant mismanagement, waste, and corruption, HUD requires PHAs like NYCHA to address life-threatening exigent health and safety issues identified in inspections within 24 hours. How is HUD monitoring and tracking whether PHAs are actually adhering to inspection results and correcting these serious health deficiencies in units?
This is one of our priority recommendations that come from an audit we did of HUD's oversight of PHAs and how they're dealing with corrective actions following REAC inspections. And it is inconsistent. It is sometimes non-existent. Sometimes they're not getting the documentation. In addition to the results from REAC, they're not ensuring that self-inspections take place. That's a very important thing that we have in place because REAC only does a percentage or a sample of units.
Are there any consequences when they're not meeting the 24-hour requirement?
That's a good question. I would need to look into what consequences. Of course, HUD always has the ability to hold them accountable, but that's, in this space, we have difficulties because we, again, to your point about the housing crisis, we only have so many units that are available. I think often HUD is reluctant sometimes to hold people accountable because they don't have other places to put people. We also have instances where we just don't have the capacity. We see capacity issues in that way as well. We see inconsistencies in the field holding PHAs accountable.
In terms of field, I mean, has HUD field staff monitored PHA's self-inspection requirements? Are people going in and doing monitoring in the field?
I don't know if they're actually going in person. There is some monitoring that's taking place, but it's inconsistent. That's why we're calling for a nationwide inspection standard, and that's why I think the Inspire rule could be helpful, but we need to see how it's going to perform.
Thank you for your work. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman from New York. The gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Timmons, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank both of the witnesses for being here today. Inspector General Tomney, you may be aware that earlier this year, the White House directed FHFA to revive a pilot program relating to title insurance waivers. While I hold concerns with the end goals of the pilot program itself, I hold even deeper concerns as to how Doma Holdings, the chosen vendor for the program, obtained this contract. To recap, when FHFA was considering this pilot last year, Doma was on the brink of bankruptcy and faced potential delisting from the New York Stock Exchange. Furthermore, the company's technology is not innovative and ranks low within the industry. The only distinguishing feature of Doma appears to be its political connections, notably with former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers serving on its board and being a shareholder. Despite Director Thompson's recent claim that no vendors have been chosen for the pilot program, my office has reviewed documents shared with mortgage lenders by Fannie Mae, which explicitly named Doma Holdings as the vendor for their new title waiver pilot program. I'm happy to provide these documents to you and your staff if you are unaware of their existence. Credit is due to Director Thompson. When I inquired about this questionable arrangement last summer, she testified that a partnership between Fannie Mae and Doma, quote, does not sound safe or sound, end quote. Shortly after our hearing, she contacted the CEO of Fannie Mae and instructed her to suspend the pilot program because of the hearing. Months later, that decision was overridden by the White House. So, Mr. Tomney, this is my question. As the FHFA's Inspector General, I urge you to investigate what led this pilot program to be revived despite FHFA's objections just last year. The public deserves to know who at the White House directed FHFA to revive this program and whether Larry Summers communicated with administration officials. So the question is, are you currently investigating this? And if not, will you commit to doing so?
I would certainly welcome you sharing that information with my staff. As I've mentioned a short time ago, we're currently planning our future products. To the extent that there'd be any open investigations, it's nothing that I'd be able to speak to in this setting, but I welcome you and your staff to provide that information to mine. I appreciate it.
We will get you those documents. And one more point, additionally, a recent Politico article reported irregularities in Doma's stock price immediately prior to President Biden's announcement of the title insurance waiver program during his State of the Union address. And while I'm confident the SEC is examining this apparent insider trading, is the FHFA investigating whether non-public information was shared with Mr. Summers or other members of the Doma board?
Again, I don't have any information on that, but again, welcome you sharing anything with my staff.
Thank you. This is just really troubling. I mean, we'll get you the Politico article, and you can see how the stock price jumped right before the announcement. The speech was not yet made public. The speech was clearly shared within somebody within the administration, with the public. That was then traded on. It's a huge violation of trust, huge violation of law. But what's even worse, in my opinion, is that this program shouldn't exist. Like, we won't even talk about the merits of the program, but the fact that the Biden administration is clearly doing the bidding of political insiders is what causes the American people to not have trust in our institutions. We have to hold these people accountable. We have to we have to earn their trust, and this does not earn their trust. It does not earn my trust, so I appreciate you looking into it. There's not a question about whether the law was broken. It doesn't take a person that prosecuted white-collar cases for 5 years like myself to look at the Politico article and look at the clear undue influence that has been clearly. I mean, it's shocking that we haven't done anything else. So I ask you to look into this. I ask you to help restore the American people's trust in our institutions, and I will get you all of this information. And thank you again, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Timmons. I'd like to thank our witnesses for your testimony today. Without objection, I'd like to enter the following documents into the record, as noted by a handful of people who made such motions. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for witnesses to the chairman, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you're able to those questions you couldn't finish or those submitted afterwards. So the hearing is now adjourned.